more about borders and sewing on borders. And really, this also applies to sewing two blocks together as well, or two pieces of fabric. Alright, so these two strips on the end have been cut. First of all, I'm going to find the middle of both the border and the top, quilt top. Fold it together, stick a pin in it, okay, or, finger press, because that way, if there's any discrepancies between the size of this and the size of that. Now we're going to talk about what putting borders on of equidistance accomplishes. This top is pieced of lots of pieces and recut pieces, so even though you may or have had perfectly square blocks, I don't personally live in that neighborhood, so I use my borders to make my quilt top lay flat, or either on the wall or on the table. If you just cut a strip and start sewing at this end and sew to there and do the same thing here, your two sides will be two different lengths. So you're going to put this down and you're going to pin through that fold and that fold. Now I want to talk to you about anytime you sew two pieces of fabric together. Just because you cut two pieces that are 3.5 inches does not mean that you won't run out of one by the end of your seam. That is due to the fact that you have something called feed dogs on your sewing machine, and that little feed dog grabs the underneath fabric and makes it go faster than the top fabric. That's why anytime you have two blocks that are the different size, put the bigger one on the bottom, and that will ease in without there being folds. Alright, so here I'm going to pin. I don't have very many pins with me right now, so bear with me. This is where I'm going to start sewing, is right here. Okay, so I've pinned that. What I want to make sure of, and it's more important on the other end than it is here, but it's still important, and sometimes I will go so far as to stick another pin in the top edge, because I don't want this to be sewn on like this. I want it to be all the way across, because you get to pulling on it as you're putting it underneath the needle. And then the same thing at this end is that you would put a pin in down here, and I'm not going to get it perfect, and then also a pin in on this side, because if you don't, you'll be unhappy. And you can see that that red piece is smaller than my pieced quilt top. On a very big quilt, I do it on the floor. I do this same process. I do it on the floor or on two tables. But if I was doing it on tables, I would secure it to the tables with some painter's tape, some not real sticky tape, so that you can pull it a little bit and get a little bit of tension. And it's the same thing, is that you don't want ripples in your quilt when, I know what I was going to say. If this was a great big quilt top, I would measure, and that just is going to tell you more about your quilt, and possibly square it up a little, and that's another whole class on getting a big quilt top ready to quilt. But if this was much bigger, then I would iron it, lay it on a table if I had one big enough, and measure, not for the purposes of cutting, but for the purposes of finding out how big my quilt top is in more than just the middle. So I wouldn't just say, oh, this will do if it was really big, because it's exponential. It's the same as, but the more pieces you put together, the more off size it will be. So I would measure in the middle and I would measure on both sides, and then I would decide either to true up my big quilt top, or I would, if it wasn't too far off, you can stretch fabric depending on which way you cut it a bit to make things work out. So I would decide which one of those two things I was either going to true up my big quilt top or just rely on the fact that my strip will grow a little bit with a little stretching. And especially if you need it to truly be, you definitely need to skewer both sides of this strip as you're sewing it. And I can't think of anything else, and if I do, I'll put it in the comments or the description.